What if the most desperate prayer ever uttered wasn't spoken in words, but in the trembling steps of a mother who refused to let go? A mare, her body shaken with exhaustion, her eyes wild with a grief no animal should know, appeared at a rancher's gate in the dead of winter. She wasn't alone. Behind her, stumbling through the snow on legs that barely held, was her foal. He was dying. The mare knew it. She had carried him through miles of frozen darkness, through wind that cut like razors, to the one place her ancient instincts told her might hold salvation. What happened next, in the brutal cold of that January night, would test the limits of one man's skill, one woman's faith, and prove that sometimes the fiercest love comes wrapped in fur and desperation. This is a story of impossible choices and even more impossible hope. If you believe in the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child, and in the quiet courage of those who refuse to turn away, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us share more stories of the extraordinary hearts that walk among us, both human and horse. The Wind River Valley of Wyoming is a place that forgives nothing. It is a land of such crystalline beauty and merciless cold that it seems designed to test the worthiness of everything that dares to live upon it. In January, the valley becomes a white cathedral of suffering, where the snow doesn't fall so much as it descends like a judgment, piling in drifts that swallow fence posts whole and bury the memory of green grass under a blank, killing silence. The temperature doesn't simply drop. It plummets to depths where breath freezes in the lungs, where exposed skin blackens in minutes, where the very air feels sharp enough to cut. The wind, always the wind, howls down from the Absaroka Range with a sound like the earth itself screaming, a relentless, battering force that strips warmth from anything foolish enough to stand against it. This is not a place for the weak. This is not a place for the unprepared. This is a place where survival is measured in split-second decisions and the stubborn refusal to yield. Kevin Hartley had lived in this unforgiving landscape for 43 years, 30 of them on the same 200 acres his father had worked before him. His ranch, the Broken H, sat at the eastern edge of the valley, where the land began its slow climb toward the mountains. It was a modest operation by Wyoming standards. 70 head of cattle, a dozen horses, a barn that leaned slightly to the north from decades of wind, and a house built from lodgepole pine that smelled permanently of wood smoke and coffee. His face was weathered to the color and texture of saddle leather, creased with lines that mapped every hard winter, every summer drought, every loss that the land demanded as its price. His hands were thick and scarred, the knuckles swollen from breaks that had healed crooked because there was never time to see a doctor when fence needed, mending, or cattle needed moving. He was a quiet man, a man of few words and fewer complaints, because complaining about the weather in Wyoming was like complaining about the sun rising. It was a waste of breath. His wife, Anne, was the one who kept the ranch books, who called the vet, who remembered which heifer was due to calve and when the hay delivery was scheduled. She was 10 years younger than Kevin. With auburn hair she kept in a practical braid and green eyes that still held flashes of the girl who'd moved west from Ohio, thinking ranch life would be romantic. She'd learned otherwise within a month, but she'd stayed anyway. Not because the dream matched reality, but because she'd discovered she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. She could pull a breech calf, splint a broken leg, and shoot a rattlesnake at 20 paces without flinching. Their daughter, Delilah, was 16, a whip-thin girl with her mother's coloring and her father's stoic silence. She rode better than most grown men, could rope a steer with casual precision, and harbored a secret dream of becoming a large animal veterinarian. A dream her parents encouraged even though they knew it meant she would leave this valley, leave this life, and probably never come back except for holidays. That was the way of it. The land took more than it gave, and what it gave most freely was the hard knowledge of what you were made of. The storm had been building for 3 days, a massive system that the Weather Service tracked with the kind of grim fascination usually reserved for incoming missiles. By the evening of January 14th, the temperature had dropped to 11 below zero, and the wind chill made it feel like 40 below. The snow was falling in thick, heavy curtains, reducing visibility to mere feet. Kevin had spent the afternoon moving the cattle into the southern pasture where a stand of cottonwoods offered some windbreak, checking water tanks to make sure they hadn't frozen solid, and hauling extra hay to the feeders. It was brutal, exhausting work, the kind that left your muscles screaming and your lungs raw from breathing air so cold it felt like inhaling broken glass. Anne had the wood stove roaring, the kitchen warm and bright against the howling darkness outside, and she'd made a pot of venison stew that filled the house with the rich smell of meat and herbs. Delilah was at the table doing calculus homework, her pencil scratching across the paper, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was a scene of ordinary domestic peace, the kind that felt precious precisely because they all knew how fragile it was, how quickly the weather could turn deadly, how many ways this land could kill you if you stopped paying attention. Kevin was pulling off his boots in the mudroom, his fingers so numb he could barely work the laces when he heard it. It wasn't loud. It was barely audible over the wind. But it was wrong. It was a sound that didn't belong. He froze, his head cocked, listening. There it was again. A whinny, high-pitched, desperate, coming from somewhere near the front gate. No horse should be out in this weather. His own were all in the barn, blanketed and fed. He shoved his feet back into his boots, ignoring Anne's questioning look, and grabbed his heavy coat from the hook. The flashlight was where it always was, hanging by the door, and he flicked it on as he pushed out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, making his eyes water instantly. The beam of the flashlight was swallowed by the snow, illuminating only a swirling white chaos. He trudged toward the gate, his boots crunching through the crust, the wind shoving at him, trying to push him back. The sound came again, closer now, and unmistakably equine. A mare's call, urgent, terrified. He reached the gate and swept the flashlight across the road. What he saw stopped his heart. A horse stood in the middle of the drifted lane, her head low, her body trembling. She was a bay mare, her coat dark with sweat despite the killing cold, steam rising from her flanks in ghostly plumes. But it was what stood behind her that made Kevin's breath catch. A foal. Impossibly small, impossibly fragile, swaying on legs that looked like they might buckle at any second. The little body was covered in ice, his mane and tail frozen into stiff clumps, his eyes half closed, his breathing visible in shallow, rapid puffs of white vapor. He was dying. Anyone with eyes could see it. The mare saw Kevin and lurched forward, her hooves slipping on the ice, and she did something no wild horse would ever do. She walked straight to him, pushing her muzzle against his chest, her breath hot and desperate against his frozen coat. Then she turned, walked back to the foal, and looked at Kevin again. The message was unmistakable. Help him, please. Kevin's mind raced. This wasn't his horse. He'd never seen this mare before, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the foal was minutes from freezing to death, and the mare had somehow known, through whatever ancient equine instinct guided her, to bring him here, to a place where humans lived, to a place where there might be help. He didn't hesitate. He opened the gate, his frozen fingers fumbling with the latch, and gestured for the mare to follow. She did, immediately, without fear, her eyes locked on him with an intensity that was almost human. The foal tried to follow, took 3 stumbling steps, and collapsed into the snow. The mare screamed, a sound of such raw anguish that it cut through the wind like a blade. Kevin ran to the foal, dropping to his knees in the snow, his flashlight clattering beside him. The little body was barely warm. The heartbeat under his hand was fluttering and irregular. The breathing shallow and labored. Hypothermia. Severe. Maybe minutes left. He scooped the foal into his arms. The little creature weighed almost nothing, felt like a bundle of frozen sticks wrapped in wet hide. He staggered to his feet, the mare pressing close against his side, and he ran, or tried to run, through the drifts toward the barn. His boots slipped, his lungs burned. The weight of the foal made his arms scream, but he didn't slow. He kicked the barn door open, the warm air inside hitting him like a wave, and he carried the foal to the nearest stall, the one they used for sick animals, the one with deep straw and a heat lamp. He laid the foal down, his hand shaking, and yelled over his shoulder, "Anne, Delilah, I need you, now." The mare followed him into the barn without being asked, her hooves loud on the concrete, and she stood at the stall door, her head over the gate, watching, her whole body quivering. Anne appeared first, her eyes going wide, then Delilah, still holding her pencil, her mouth fallen open. Kevin was already stripping off his coat, his mind clicking through the steps he'd learned from a lifetime of ranching. Warm him slowly. Too fast and you'll shock the system. Dry him. Get his core temperature up. Check for frostbite. Get fluids in him if he can swallow. And get every towel we have. Delilah, start filling hot water bottles, not boiling, just hot. Move. They moved. Anne vanished and reappeared with an armload of towels, and she dropped to her knees beside Kevin, rubbing the foal's legs, his neck, his belly, her hands working in fast, efficient circles. Delilah returned with 4 rubber hot water bottles wrapped in dish towels, and Kevin positioned them carefully around the foal's body, avoiding direct contact with the skin. The foal's eyes were closed, his breathing still terrifyingly shallow. Kevin tilted the small head back gently, checking the gums. They were pale, almost white, not good. He looked at the mare, still standing vigil at the gate, and something in her eyes, some desperate, pleading intelligence, made his throat tighten. This wasn't just a horse. This was a mother begging for her child's life. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of cows standing over stillborn calves, in the eyes of a dog whose puppy had been hit by a car. It was grief, it was love, it was hope clinging by its fingernails. "We need the vet," Anne said quietly, her hands never stopping their work. Kevin shook his head. "No way anyone's driving in this. The roads are buried. We're on our own." Delilah looked up, her young face pale but determined. "What do we do?" Kevin took a breath. He'd delivered dozens of foals, treated sick horses, set broken bones, but this was beyond anything he'd faced. This wasn't injury. This was a body shutting down from cold, from exhaustion, from something else he couldn't name. We keep him warm, we keep him breathing, and we pray he's got enough fight left in him. For the next 2 hours they worked in a silence broken only by the storm outside and the occasional soft nicker from the mare. They rotated the hot water bottles as they cooled, replaced the damp towels with dry ones, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, the foal's body began to warm. His breathing deepened, his heart rate steadied. But he didn't wake. Kevin checked his legs, his hooves, looking for signs of frostbite. The ears were the worst, the tips blackened and hard. He'd lose part of them, maybe all of them, but he'd live without ears. What worried Kevin more was the foal's stillness, the way his eyes stayed closed even as his body warmed. At 10 o'clock, Anne went to the house and returned with a baby bottle fitted with a lamb's nipple, filled with warm electrolyte solution the vet had left them months ago for a sick calf. She knelt beside the foal, gently pried his mouth open, and dribbled a few drops onto his tongue. Nothing. She tried again. This time the small tongue moved, just a flicker, and the foal swallowed. It was a reflex, barely conscious, but it was something. Anne kept at it, patient and steady, getting a few ounces into him over the next 20 minutes. By midnight, Delilah had fallen asleep sitting against the stall wall, her head on her drawn-up knees, and Anne's eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. Kevin sat with his back against the rough wood, the foal's head resting on his lap, his hand on the small rib cage, feeling the rise and fall of breath. The mare had finally laid down just outside the stall, her legs folded beneath her chin resting on the ground, her eyes never leaving her baby. Kevin looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time he noticed the details. She was thin, too thin, her ribs visible beneath her winter coat. Her hooves were overgrown, cracked, untrimmed for months. She had old scars on her shoulders, marks that looked like they came from a rope or wire, and her mane was tangled with burrs. This was not a pampered horse. This was a horse who'd been neglected, maybe abandoned. And yet she'd fought through a killing storm, miles probably, to bring her foal to the one place she thought might save him. "How did you know to come here?" Kevin whispered. "How did you know?" The mare blinked slowly, her large dark eyes holding his, and for a moment Kevin felt something pass between them, something that had no words, only understanding. She had known because mothers always know. They know when to fight and when to run and when to beg. They know that sometimes survival means swallowing pride, means trusting the very species that might have hurt you before, means doing the impossible because the alternative is unthinkable. At 2 in the morning, the foal's eyes opened. They were glassy, unfocused, but they were open. He made a sound, a tiny, breathy whinny, and the mare surged to her feet, her head thrusting over the gate, her nostrils flaring. Kevin's heart leapt. "Hey there, little man." He stroked the soft neck, felt the muscles twitch under his hand. "You with us?" The foal blinked, his eyes tracking slowly to Kevin's face, then to the mare. He tried to lift his head, managed an inch, then let it drop back down. But he was awake. He was aware. He was alive. Anne, still awake in the corner, let out a shaky breath that might have been a laugh or a sob. "He's going to make it." Kevin didn't want to jinx it, didn't want to assume anything, 'cause he'd seen animals rally only to crash hours later. But he nodded. Maybe. Yeah, maybe he is. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the world buried under 2 feet of fresh snow and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The temperature had climbed to a balmy 5 above zero, and the sun, pale and distant, cast long shadows across the glittering drifts. Kevin had dozed fitfully in the stall, waking every 20 minutes to check the foal, and when the morning light slanted through the barn's high windows, he saw the little creature was trying to stand. His legs were shaky, his movements uncoordinated, but he was trying. The mare, who hadn't eaten or drunk anything all night, nickered softly, encouragingly, and the foal responded, his small voice reedy but determined. Kevin stood, his back protesting, every joint stiff and aching, and he opened the stall gate. The mare walked in slowly, carefully, and nuzzled her baby, licking his face, his ears, his neck, a low, continuous rumble of sound vibrating in her chest. The foal leaned into her, drawing strength from her presence, and after 3 tries, he got his front legs under him, then his back, and he stood. He swayed, his knees knocking together, but he stood. Delilah appeared in the doorway, her hair mussed from sleep, her eyes widening. "Dad? Oh my God, Dad, he's up." Kevin smiled, a rare, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He's a tough one. Anne came in behind Delilah, carrying a bucket of warm grain mash and an armload of hay. She set the bucket down, and the mare, finally allowing herself to tend to her own needs, plunged her muzzle into it, eating with desperate, ravenous bites. Kevin watched the mare eat, watched the foal nurse, wobbly but successful, and he felt a bone-deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with money or pride, and everything to do with the simple, profound fact that something that should have died had lived. The foal would lose the tips of his ears to frostbite, and he'd carry a slight limp in his right hind leg for the rest of his life, a reminder of that night. But he would live. He would grow strong, and the mare, once she was fed and rested and her hooves were trimmed and her wounds treated, would become the calmest, most trusting horse Kevin had ever known, as if she understood that she'd been given a second chance and intended to honor it. The question of where the mare had come from haunted Kevin for days. He called the sheriff, described the horse, asked if anyone had reported a missing mare and foal. Nothing. He posted notices at the feed store, the vet clinic, the diner in town. No one claimed her. He checked for a brand, for a microchip, anything that might identify an owner. She had neither. It was Delilah who found the clue 2 weeks later while riding, fence on the northern boundary of their property. She came back leading a second horse, a gelding, gaunt and limping, with a rope halter hanging broken around his neck. He'd been wandering the hills, half-starved, and when Delilah followed his tracks back, they led to the remains of an old homestead 3 miles into the national forest. The cabin was collapsed, the roof caved in from snow, and scattered in the clearing were the frozen bodies of 4 more horses, all dead, all bearing the same marks of neglect. There was no sign of a human. Kevin reported it, and the sheriff's investigation pieced together the story. The homestead had belonged to an old hermit, a man named Vincent Cray, who'd lived off the grid for 20 years. He'd died, they estimated, sometime in early December, probably a heart attack, and his horses had been left to fend for themselves. Most had stayed near the cabin, loyal to the end, and had starved or frozen. But the mare, heavily pregnant and driven by an instinct stronger than loyalty to a dead man, had left. She'd survived in the forest for weeks, given birth alone in the cold, and when her foal began to fail, she'd done the unthinkable. She'd sought help from humans. She'd walked through a blizzard, through miles of wilderness, to the nearest ranch, trusting that someone, somewhere, would see her desperation and answer it. The story spread through the valley like wildfire, carried by the wind and the gossip networks that linked every ranch and town. Reporters called, wanting to do a piece on the miracle horse. Kevin refused them all. This wasn't a story for outsiders. This was just life. This was just what you did when something needed help. But the community understood what the mare had done, understood the courage it took, and over the following weeks, gifts appeared at the Broken H's gate. bags of feed, bales of hay, a new winter blanket, a hand-carved nameplate for the stall. The nameplate read Hope, because that's what the mare had carried through the storm. Not just her foal, but hope itself. Spring came slowly to the Wind River Valley, the snow retreating inch by stubborn inch, revealing the brown grass beneath, still dormant but waiting. By April, the foal, now named Chance by Delilah, was racing around the pasture on legs that had grown strong and sure, his cropped ears giving him a lopsided, endearing look. Hope, the mare, watched him from the fence line, her body filled out, her coat glossy, her eyes calm. She'd been integrated into the ranch's herd, and she'd become Delilah's project, a horse the girl worked with every day, teaching her to trust a lead rope, to accept a saddle, to understand that not all humans were neglectful or cruel. Anne had documented the mare's transformation in a series of photographs, and when Delilah applied for a summer internship at the veterinary college in Laramie, she included those photos in her application, along with an essay about what she'd learned that January night. She wrote about resilience, about the language of desperation that crosses species, about the responsibility humans have to answer when trust is offered. She was accepted. The letter came in May, and Anne cried, and Kevin said nothing but gripped his daughter's shoulder hard enough to bruise, which was his way of saying he was proud. On a warm June evening, with the valley finally green and the wind gentle for once, Kevin stood at the pasture fence watching Chance and Hope graze side by side. The foal, no longer so small, had his mother's dark bay coloring and her intelligent eyes, but he had something else too, something harder to name. A spark, a defiance, a refusal to quit. Delilah came to stand beside him, her boots scuffing the dirt, her hands shoved in her pockets. You ever wonder what would have happened if she hadn't come here? Kevin was quiet for a long moment. Every day. Delilah looked up at him, her young face serious. Why do you think she picked us? Kevin shook his head slowly. I don't know that she picked us, exactly. I think she just kept walking until she found someone. We just happened to be the ones here. But maybe, Delilah said, her voice soft, maybe she knew. Maybe she could tell, somehow, that you'd help. Kevin considered that, turning it over in his mind. He'd never been a man given to sentimentality, never believed in fate or destiny or any of that nonsense. But he couldn't deny what he'd seen in the mare's eyes that night. It wasn't just fear. It wasn't just desperation. It was something closer to faith. The summer passed in the way of ranch summers, full of work and heat and the constant grinding effort to prepare for the winter that would inevitably come again. Delilah left for her internship in July, and the house felt emptier without her. But Anne and Kevin fell into the rhythm of it, the two of them working the land as they had for decades. Hope proved herself invaluable, calm and steady under saddle, never spooking, never shying, as if she'd decided that, having been saved, she owed something in return. Kevin rode her often, and he found that she had a way of sensing his mood, of adjusting her gait to match his energy, of simply being present in a way that eased the loneliness he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Chance grew into a handsome yearling, bold and curious, and Anne started his training with a patience that surprised even her. She'd never considered herself a horse trainer, but there was something about this particular colt, this child of desperation and survival, that called to her. She worked with him in the round pen, teaching him voice commands, teaching him to trust the pressure of a rope, and he learned quickly, as if he'd inherited not just his mother's intelligence, but her understanding that humans could be partners, not just predators. In September, a journalist from a national magazine showed up at the ranch unannounced, having heard the story third hand and wanting to write a feature. Kevin met her at the gate, his face impassive, and told her politely but firmly to leave. She tried to argue, said it was a story people needed to hear, that it would inspire them. Kevin shook his head. "It's not a story," he said. "It's their life, and it's private." The journalist left, frustrated, but she didn't push. There was something in the rancher's eyes, a quiet steel, that told her pushing would be a mistake. But the story didn't die. It lived in the valley, told and retold in diners and feed stores, a story that became part of the local mythology, a reminder that sometimes, even in the harshest places, grace happens, that sometimes the land gives back, that sometimes love, whether it walks on 2 legs or 4, is strong enough to defy the cold. By the time winter returned, hope and chance were inseparable, and the ranch had settled into a new normal. Kevin had added a second Foal stall to the barn, reinforced and heated just in case. Anne had started volunteering at the county animal shelter, fostering dogs and cats that needed a temporary home, as if saving one mare and her foal had awakened something in her, a need to offer refuge. Delilah came home for Christmas, taller somehow, more confident, full of stories about cadaver labs and surgical techniques, and she spent hours in the barn with Hope and Chance, grooming them, talking to them, telling them about her future plans. On Christmas Eve, the family stood in the barn as the snow fell softly outside, the horses warm and content in their stalls, and Anne said a quiet prayer of thanks. Not to anyone in particular, just to the universe, to the strange and mysterious forces that had brought a dying foal and his desperate mother to their gate on the coldest night of the year. Kevin didn't pray. He never had. But he rested his hand on Hope's neck, felt the strong, steady pulse of her heartbeat, and he thought about how close they'd all come to a different ending. How easily he could have missed the sound of her call in the storm. How easily he could have decided it was too cold, too dangerous, too much trouble. How easily Chance could have died in that stall despite everything they did. But none of those things had happened. The mare had called, he had answered, the foal had lived. And in the stark, unforgiving landscape of the Wind River Valley, that was as close to a miracle as you were likely to get. Delilah looked at her father, saw the rare softness in his weathered face, and she understood, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to be a rancher. It wasn't about the money or the land or even the animals themselves. It was about showing up. It was about answering the call when it came, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was terrifying, even when you had no idea if you could actually help. It was about trying anyway. Years would pass, and Hope would give birth to 3 more foals, all strong, all healthy, and Chance would grow into a dependable ranch horse, patient and calm, the kind of horse you could put a beginner on without worry. Delilah would graduate, become a veterinarian, and open a practice in the valley, choosing to stay rather than leave, choosing this hard, beautiful place over easier options. She would tell the story of Hope and Chance to her clients, using it to illustrate the resilience of animals, the importance of not giving up, the small miracles that happen when people care enough to act. And sometimes, late at night, when a rancher called her out to a desperate situation, a mare in distress or foal in trouble, she would think of that January night, of her father kneeling in the snow, of her mother's steady hands, of the mare who had walked through a blizzard to ask for help, and she would try to be worthy of that trust. Kevin would live to see his grandchildren ride Chance's offspring, would watch Hope grow old with a grace and dignity that seemed almost human. And when the mare finally passed, at the age of 23, on a warm spring morning with the sun on her face, he would bury her on the hillside overlooking the pasture, under a simple stone marker that read only her name and the year she had arrived. No explanation, no story, just hope. Because that was enough. That said everything. Anne would plant wildflowers on the grave, and every spring they would bloom, bright and defiant against the still harsh landscape, a small splash of color in a world of brown and gray and white. And the ranch would go on, as ranches do, with new horses and new challenges and new winters that tested, and new springs that forgave. But the story of the mare who walked through the storm, who trusted when trust should have been impossible, who saved her foal by surrendering her pride and asking for help, that story would remain. It would be told to children on cold nights, a bedtime story with a happy ending. It would be told to hands around campfires, a reminder of why the work mattered. It would be told to newcomers to the valley, an initiation into the unspoken code of this place, the understanding that when someone, anyone, anything, shows up at your gate asking for help, you answer. The Wind River Valley remains a place of harsh subtraction, a landscape that forgives nothing and forgets even less. The wind still howls down from the mountains with a sound like the earth screaming. The snow still piles in drifts that swallow the unwary, and the cold still kills with an indifferent mineral efficiency. But it is also a place where a mare once walked through a blizzard, carrying hope in the form of a dying foal, where a rancher once opened his gate at midnight to a stranger's desperate plea, where a family once spent a long night fighting for a life that wasn't theirs to claim, but was theirs to save. And in the end, that is what transforms a landscape from merely harsh to holy, from simply beautiful to sacred. Not the absence of suffering, but the presence of those who refuse to look away from it. Not the miracle of the rescue, but the choice to try. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that courage sometimes looks like a mother's desperate journey or a stranger's open gate, then share it. Subscribe to this channel so we can continue bringing you tales of the extraordinary bonds between humans and horses, stories of resilience and grace in the hardest places. Because these stories matter. They remind us that we are not alone in the cold, that help is possible, that love, in all its forms, is the only force strong enough to walk through a blizzard and still arrive, trembling but unbroken at the door.